I've been invited this afternoon to talk about these things we call corporate chains or corporate practice and what it means to us. I've been a consultant in the UK and then increasingly across Europe and the rest of the world for 20 years now. And so I've watched the evolution of the veterinary marketplaces in which I've worked. And what strikes me from my background, and I used to be a senior manager in corporate enterprise with lots of responsibility, running a large organization, is that actually when we look at any veterinary marketplace, we can see how that market is evolving. And through that evolution, we discover that corporate chains play a part. And so what I want to do is start by taking us back and looking at the UK as an example, but there's lots of different markets I could have looked at that have evolved in the same way. And what I would say to you is you will see similarities in your marketplace. You know, in the last 2 years, I've been into China, I've been into Indonesia, I've been into Singapore, I've talked to veterinary owners from Japan and from Australia and from New Zealand. And when we talk about the evolution of markets, we see the same patterns emerging. And that's what we should expect, because it isn't just the veterinary market that evolves in this way, lots of markets evolve in this way. And so that's what we want to do. So let's go back and have a little look at the beginning. So once upon a time, as we say in the UK, when we start a fairy story for our kids. So if we look back, then veterinary practice started with the need to support the production of food, so with farm animals, and transport, horses and oxen and other beasts of burden. And that's where it all came from. And so what we found is that vets were principally one man, and it typically was a man, and a bag with some tools in it. And they went from place to place. In fact, I think in the UK, the earliest vets were acknowledged to be the blacksmiths, the people who put their shoes on horses, because they had a knowledge of how horses worked. And you went to them if your horse was lame or unwell. So the principal surgeon was a service we offered the public was a vet with a bag. But of course, then our science started to evolve, and initially it involves in academia. We see that the first centres of growth in any country are usually its universities, however they happen to be structured. And so we find that from lots of individual vets practicing in their own way, we see centres of excellence starting to emerge around these academic centres. More vets become skilled in this emerging science, and the cost of the technology that are used in veterinary practice continues to fall. And so we see that science can move away from academia. And so we start to see veterinary practices of some scale starting to form. Perhaps private specialists or hospitals or referral centres or however we wish to refer to them. But it's no longer just the academics and academia that have this facility. But then countries evolve. And so we see rising living standards together with improved housing, more leisure time, starts to enable this thing we call pet ownership or companion animal ownership or small animal practice. Because before that, we didn't have them. Everything was a working animal. We had dogs because they gathered up sheep or cows. We had cats because they kept the rats down. And suddenly we've got this emerging new market that we've never had. Now, in Europe, we can probably look at a date and say that was probably around 1955 to 1960, post the Second World War, as we tend to refer to it, when a group of citizens emerged that had free time and free money. In some of the Far Eastern markets, that's much more recent. It's only happened in the last 10 or perhaps 15 years that marketplace for companion animals has started to emerge. So with it, we see that rise then of small animals. Suddenly there's a market, there's a demand, vets can show an interest in it, there's a business to be made. And so we start to see clinics and vets emerging that only focus on the needs of companion animals. And I would guess that many of you today come from a practice that only deals with companion animals. Who's companion animal only or small animal only? Yeah, probably about more than half of you. And the others are still mixed models, but you will see in your marketplace that mixed model will continue to change. Pharmaceutical solutions to illness were developed, and so we saw vets having to increase the importance and the use of drugs and treatment plans. And so we start to see rules and regulations around the prescription and the supply of drugs. And different countries apply themselves in different way, but we've had to address it as a profession. New diagnostics come on. It's changing all the time, isn't it? We were hearing lectures yesterday about what they're able to do. You know, it always fascinates me as the non-vet, what you guys can do when you put your mind to it. And it's changing all the time. I know it is in the human field. I've benefited from it, and we know it is in our field too. But all of that requires additional facilities, additional staff, additional investment in the business to make all that happen. And so the profession evolves new ownership models. In the UK, it was partnership, a number of vets pooling resources together to form a bigger practice that could afford to buy the latest X-ray or the latest ultrasound or the latest endoscopy or whatever the piece of technology is. But we've enabled that to happen. We see that countries become concerned after a short while about animal welfare, and so they bring in regulations about who can perform veterinary surgery. So in the UK, we have the Veterinary Surgeons Act. In other countries, it's something similar. The right to treat becomes that of the veterinary surgeon. And with it becomes legal frameworks, which often restricts who can own a veterinary practice, because it's felt there needs to be a link between the ownership and responsibility. So we tend to see legislation that says, well, only vets can do it, but the way we control that is if a vet doesn't do it properly, we can take away their livelihood. So we make them the owners of the business, and then we've got this powerful control mechanism. So these regulations all emerge for a real reason. We know why they're there. But our practices are getting bigger, our technologies are getting bigger, our buildings are getting more complex, the facilities take more management, there's more expensive stock. There's a whole new raft of management costs and skills that the profession's had to develop. It's had to make those investments. And depending on where your marketplace is, will depend on whether you've just started to do that, or like the mature markets, we've been doing it for quite some time. But we create larger practice groups where these costs can be more effectively shared. So eventually a market reaches a point, and in the UK, that was around 1997. In other markets, it's different points, and some it's yet to achieve it. But what you've got is relatively large numbers of privately owned practices or small practice groups. That's what the veterinary marketplace looks like. Few groups have more than a few branches. Often they're very geographically based. So there'll be a few people that have got a few more, but most people don't have many or have one. Lots of locations are only served by one practice, the only vet in town. And there's often limited or no competition between those veterinary practices. Often they're working together to provide support for clients at weekends or at night. There's a lot of cooperation, sharing services and facilities. And that need to share them creates kind of bond between them. But that bond prevents competition in the marketplace. And externally, people will be concerned about that. What does all that mean to your customers? But what it means is that if an economist looks at your marketplace, as happened in the UK in 1997, they'll call the marketplace failing. It's failing in economic terms because it's actually created something that's unsustainable. It's unsustainable because small business units are structurally inefficient. There's lots of duplication of things. There's lots of costs that aren't properly spread across a lot of usage. We've got an expensive piece of equipment, we use it 10 times a week. We could be using it 1,000 times a week, but we only use it 10 times a week. We've got staff that aren't really utilised. You know, the typical vet is only doing what a vet gets paid for half the time. So even our principal asset, our vets, are heavily underutilised. Why? Because in small practices, everybody has to do everything, don't they? So many costs get duplicated across a marketplace. We've all got that little bit of extra cost. We have no way of sharing it between your practice and my practice, his practice and her practice. New technologies become unaffordable, so some practices can't deliver good veterinary medicine Because what's expected by the clients, what's expected by the profession, requires an investment in technology that some practices can't afford to make. So what do we do with them? Do we allow them to carry on practicing in a suboptimal way, or do we somehow stop them? Who's protecting the client? Who's protecting the patient? And often there's limited or no choice. And if there's limited or no choice, there's no competition. What's holding prices down? Well, nothing, because actually we all go to the same CPD lecture and quietly tell each other what we're going to put the prices up by. I've worked in the profession for 20 years. I know how it works. But what it means is if you're looked at from outside, as we were in the UK in 1997, it doesn't look good. Because what all this lot means, and the supply side's got a few suppliers, so they've got a lot of power too, which isn't helpful. What it means is we're using our labour and resources ineffectively. That means it's costing more than it should. And at the end of the day, we have to pass the cost on to one person. Only one person bears the cost of all our inefficiencies, and that's our customer. And that's why external regulators get concerned. Because what they see is our customers paying too much. And the big customers, food production in particular, will be paying far too much. And that's what pushes regulators to act. Because the business model we've created isn't actually meeting the needs of our clients in the best possible way. And so it's those pressures that force markets to change. And so how do they change? Well, in the UK, and it's not untypical of what happened, is we had this thing called deregulation. Well, deregulation firstly allowed veterinary practices to become limited companies and for non-vets to own shares in that company. So in the UK, up until 1997, a non-vet couldn't own a veterinary practice. I think in France, even today, a non-vet can only own half a veterinary practice. In different countries, it's different around the world. Some countries never regulated in the first place, and so they don't have this problem. But deregulation is what enables the next step to happen. And in the UK and in other markets, I've seen a relaxation of rules surrounding marketing and promotion. Often marketplaces actually discouraged the competition between veterinary practices because they wanted to encourage cooperation as a solution to the problem that everyone knew was out there. So why do we deregulate? And it's important to remember what drove it on. The first one is because it was a recognition that practices need to be able to attract money from outside. And you're not going to be able to do that effectively unless there's some kind of ownership involvement. That's the natural way that businesses evolve and attract investment. It allows the formation of more efficient organizations. So organizations that scale, and that can make them more efficient. It brings in external skills. So people that have done things in a different industry can now find a way of entering our profession and bringing their expertise and knowledge with them to the benefit of our profession and our clients. And of course, it stimulates competition because it creates a shake-up in the marketplace, and market forces dictate that competition is what keeps the strong getting stronger and takes the weak away so that clients always get the best possible service at the best possible price. That's what free markets do. So what have we seen post-deregulation? And again, it doesn't matter which marketplace you're in, whether you've had to deregulate or not, we see the same evolution starting to happen. The emergence of what we call corporate veterinary practice in one shape or form. That's, to be said, just a larger veterinary group. So there's three basic models that emerge. It's important that we understand them. The first one is just a large private veterinary group. We have them in the UK. I've seen them elsewhere in the world. We have what we call venture capital-backed groups. So these are people that have venture capitalists who make investments in the veterinary profession. And of course, we've got these things called joint venture partnerships, which is a slightly different model. And we'll look at all three of them, because all three of them will affect your market if they aren't already doing so today. So private veterinary groups is really just an extension of the larger veterinary groups that most markets have at some point in time. They've usually got a small number of owners. Often they're funded by traditional borrowings from the bank. perhaps leveraged against properties or other assets that the practice owns. Typically, they grow to be 20 to 30 clinics in size. Sometimes they get a little bit bigger, but mostly they don't. Their growth is constrained by their ability to bring in external funding. It costs money to open new branches, to invest in new technology, and there's only so much you can borrow in a traditional manner. And they start to suffer from what I call a shortage of veterinary managers. And this is a really important point to note, that as the profession embraces the notion of a larger veterinary group, once you get above 15 to 20 branches, you can't manage it from the middle. You need to have some other form of management, some sort of regional or area management that sits in between the two. And those people don't exist when this first starts to happen, because the profession hasn't needed them. These individuals need to have both a knowledge of corporate management and what the corporation expects of them, but have the credibility to manage vets. And vets don't like being managed by people who know nothing about their world, trust me. So it takes time, and so actually all groups, as they start to grow, discover they need this group of people, and they don't have them. You can bring in external expertise to the core, that works quite well. But this middle management, this area, regional management, whatever you want to call it, has to be this unique blend, and they aren't there. And so people have to start training them. So all groups, whether they're private groups or corporate groups, all struggle with this middle management. And in fact, even in the UK today, we're still struggling with it. So here's a good example. This is Goddard's. They're a privately owned veterinary group based in London. They've got 60-odd practices and they're doing very well. Well managed, well run, but they are a traditional veterinary practice in that they've used traditional borrowings to grow and have established themselves at quite some significant size and scale. Then we get what we call the venture capital-backed corporate acquirers. So these are corporate groups that start to emerge, and they want to buy up existing practices. They're funded by external capital. In the very early days, we tend to call that venture capital, because venture capitalists are those people who take risks at the start of a business. The risks are very high, but the rewards can be very high too. But they're a specialist form of investor. And so that's why we tend to refer to them as venture capital-backed groups, because that's how they start. They usually start using a combination of borrowings and further venture capital to make them grow. And as groups develop, they may attract new corporate investment partners. Because as the group grows and becomes more mature, the type of investor that wants to invest in it changes. So it's quite normal to see an early investor exit and a new investor join, because it's now in the next phase of its growth. And different investors feel their expertise lies in different parts of a business's growth. So it's perfectly normal to see that happen. And of course, the ultimate aim could either be a public flotation or a complete acquisition by a larger player. And that's often the goal of all those investors along the way. So if we look at independent vet care in the UK, it's a good example. And we've seen lots of these. You could look at JVC. VCA in America is another good example if you want to look at how a corporate evolves, read a bit about their history and just see how the various phases materialized over time. So IVC was formed in 2011 when August Equity, so a venture capital group, encouraged two large practice groups, in this case Bath Vets and the Row Vet Group, to actually merge together and form the nucleus of a new group. So together with the owners of those practices, the venture capitalists formed a new company. That used the venture capital money to continue to acquire new practices until in 2014, August Equity sold their share to Summit Partners. So Summit Partners are another investment house. They specialize more in a slightly mature business, so they bought into it. And in 2016, they sold out to EQT, who already owned Evidensia. So that for them was clearly a merging of two more now maturing veterinary groups. And that's perfectly normal. It's what you'd expect to see. There was nothing unusual about that. Although I know from the comments I got in the UK market, people say, oh, no, what's going on? Well, what's going on is perfectly normal. So don't be afraid of it. It's what we can expect to happen. Often corporate acquirers will keep the existing practice names. Two reasons for that. The first is that it still keeps all its local connections and feels, so its customer base still feels connected with the practice. But secondly, changing the practice name and rebranding it costs money. And often corporate acquirers want to use that money to acquire another practice, not to rebrand the ones that they've got. So the priority in the early days is acquisition. It's less about reinvestment in existing practices. Over time, that has to change. And so we see the corporate groups having to invest more in their existing estate, and that leaves them less to invest in new estates, so their rate of growth tends to slow. So the corporate consolidators acquire existing clinics and locations. They often have quite a broad remit. Some of them are quite specialized and pick a particular type of practice to invest in, but many are just happy to acquire practices. And so we see a large scattering. It may be small animal, it may be equine, it may be mixed. They all have a different remit as to what they do. Clearly, they can share the development of advertising, promotion, so corporates have this advantage of sharing some of the back office costs across a large number of groups. They tend to bring management expertise from other fields in, which understands operations perhaps better than we did in the veterinary world. And so we see some more innovative back office operations going on to reduce the cost of those services to the practice group. Because of scale, they're much more efficient. It's quite interesting when you look at the numbers. They don't often spend less on all the back office things like marketing and promotion and HR and the like, but what they provide for that investment is significantly more, because they've got a very specialist team sat in the head office, which no private practice would have that level of expertise available to it unless it paid a very large amount of money. So they tend to do more for the money that they spend, but they don't tend to spend a lot different from a private practice. And of course, the result is improved financial performance. And we can see that with the value of these companies and the way in which they grow. The final model we call the joint venture partnership model, and it was built on the opticians' experience, particularly across Europe. So we had Vision Express and Specsavers are the two big examples of it. So this is where there's a central service company that's owned, and they create a joint venture arrangement with each of their individual practices. They're usually branded because they recognize the power of brand, and they're usually opening new sites, which enables them to brand them from day one. So branding becomes more attractive to them. Individual branches are usually funded by borrowings of the joint venture partner. So the central service company isn't making the big investments here. The joint venture partners are. That's the subtle difference in the model. The other thing to note is that many of the intermediate management problems get solved by this model, because they, of course, have an owner-manager who's much more driven than a clinical director would be, because it's their practice. And so it solves many of those problems, which is why it's an attractive model to look at. But of course, they can be multimodal. So we're seeing, for example, the Vets for Pets in the UK. They've now got about 50 of their clinics that are managed centrally, and the other 600 and something are individual JVPs. So they don't stick to one model. They often have a bit of a mixed model in the way that they go. So this is Vets for Pets, Companion Care. So they merged two companies. They were originally both JVP models, independently run. Pets at Home acquired Companion Care when the original Companion Care went into liquidation, so it went bust in the early days. And they acquired it then, and then they more recently acquired Vets for Pets, and that's the brand they now intend to use. And so we see them changing in terms of what they do. These are much more disruptive in a veterinary marketplace because they open new branches. Corporate acquirers don't change the veterinary marketplace because they just acquire a practice that already exists. They would hope to make it more effective in the way it competes in its marketplace, but they haven't actually fundamentally changed that local market. These people do because they come along and open a brand new clinic. And so it provides a wider choice for clients, and that must impact some of the existing practices that are in that area. They tend to go for high visibility locations, so often in pet stores and those sort of locations, common branding and service image, which allows them to advertise nationally and locally. They tend to use a high level of advertising and promotion. They tend to be very consumer-led, so they're often quite innovative in terms of the service offering that they make to clients, because they realize they've got to attract people to them when they open. Like other corporates, they've got very efficient back office services that can keep those costs low. And as a result, again, they tend to have improved financial performance across the group. In the UK, CVS, which is a corporate acquirer, and Vets for Pets are both public companies. That means they have to publish their results. So if you're interested to see how these work, just go online, find their website. There'll always be a link to what they call their investor relations page, and there you'll see their latest information for shareholders, and you can read exactly what they're up to, what their plans are, what's going well, what's not going well. And if you own a veterinary practice, you ought to be doing it just to see what these guys are at and where they're going to. So if we look at corporate practice, what are its strengths? Well, its strengths are the things that it was created to do. It's about economy of scale, particularly on the purchasing side. We see a significant difference between the percentage of turnover that a private practice spends on buying in its goods and services for resale, and the percentage of turnover that's typically spent by a large corporate. In the UK, that's probably between 5 and 7% of turnover. So it's a massive difference to the financial performance, particularly given that in the UK, the average practice makes a profit of 3 to 5%. So actually being acquired by a corporate immediately doubles the profit, at least. Okay, so their financial model works well. They obviously bring a more professional leadership and management, certainly in terms of strategic and operational management, because that's their expertise that they bring in from outside. They've got more centralized and cost-effective back office functions. In particular, they're really strong on human resources and marketing, two areas that private practices are notoriously bad at. And the other thing we're seeing is they recognize the need to grow and develop their staff. So we're seeing corporates provide a far greater range of opportunities for individuals to grow. So that brings us to the question, well, how do independents compete? And if these guys have got so many advantages, what's the point for the rest of us? Do we just throw our teddy bear in the corner and go home, or what do we do? Well, I hope not. If you're an independent practice, I hope you don't do that. I hope you continue to compete. The key thing is to recognize that you compete by being unique, which means you have to be distinct and desirable. The one good thing about competing with a corporate is you know what they're going to do. In the case of CVS or Vets for Pets, they tell you. Every 6 months, they give you a little briefing as to what they're up to. So we know exactly what they're going to do. What they do is the same thing well in lots of locations. It doesn't take long to work out what that looks like. So at least you know what they look like as a competitor. I'd rather be competing with the practices I've worked with a corporate, who we know what they're up to, than with a very agile, dynamic private practice that's constantly catching us out because they're trying new things all the time. Because that's what we've got to do to be independent. We've got to be that dynamic, customer-driven practice. So we've got to think about the look and feel of our clinics. We've got to be innovative in terms of the products and services that we offer to make ourselves distinct and desirable. We've got to be much more responsive to our clients' needs. We've got to give them a reason to come to us. We might have to end up charging them a bit more. That's the reality of it. So we've got to give them a reason to pay that little bit more. So we've got to be good at what we do. We've got to be agile. Corporates aren't very good at being agile. It's like a super tanker. It takes a little while to turn it around a corner. You know, we're the sailing dinghy. We can get around that corner really quickly if we want to. We've got to learn to be that agile, to keep that one step ahead of them. There's also a rule about sail before steam. You know, that's how it should work. We can get in front and just make ourselves a real nuisance. It's great fun. And we've got to embed ourselves in our community. We've got to recognize that one thing that clients don't like about corporates is they feel a bit anonymous. They often like the price that they'll offer. They'll often be very competitive about their first opinion services. Clients like those things, but what they also dislike is that these things often feel anonymous. They don't feel like something we're part of. And we work in an emotional industry. You know, the bulk of our clients have companion animals because they love them. They want to be emotionally involved with their vets, don't they? You guys all know that. So that's what our advantage is as an independent, is to be agile, stay in front, and be bonded into our community so we know what we're doing. We've also got to think about how we can cooperate with each other as independents. So in the UK, we've seen the formation of associations where practices pay to be part of a club. That club organises central events, central resources that all the practices can share. So it distributes the cost. It achieves some economy of scale. We see these things called buying groups, which is something similar. So groups of practices all buying through a single source that can have more leverage with the supply side, and so get everybody a better deal that's within them. So we try to find ways of increasing the buying power of an independent, of sharing best practice between ourselves, and making use of shared services so we can avoid some of the duplication that being small and independent always brings. But there's lots of ways we can compete, and that's the important message. So what's in it for you? Well, if you're the clinic owner, what are the threats? Well, increased competition. What's interesting is, in the UK is a good example of it. Initially, the corporates didn't bump into each other. They didn't have the scale. They were all buying in different parts of the country, so they could all carry on. It's only recently they've all got big enough to start bumping into each other. And so now we're seeing the corporates competing with the other corporates. So in the early days, they never competed on price because they didn't have to. They were only competing with independent practices, and they had a price point they couldn't afford to get beneath. But now they're competing with each other. They're going to start driving prices down. There's no question about that. We're starting to see it already, and in more mature markets, we've seen it already. Okay, so we know that point's going to come in time. There'll be increased competition. They probably will drop the prices of routine services. Get used to it. Think about how you're delivering your services. Okay, there's a price point that you can justify, a little premium that your clients will pay, but it can't be too big. Okay, clients will pay a premium for you over a corporate. Clients will pay a premium over you for online, but it can't be too big. So we need to think about how we achieve that. There'll be a competition for staff, particularly if they're a JVP and opening new branches. It creates a need for new vet posts, new nursing posts, new reception posts. They'll look to recruit the best staff they can in the area. They can be quite attractive to staff, so we need to think about what that means. But there's opportunities. We know the competitor. That's always an opportunity in business. They tend to use a lot of promotion, and what we found in the UK is that promotion increased awareness in pet owners across the board. And so all the local practices benefited when the corporate started to advertise, because they were perhaps educating clients to the need of preventative health care, and the private practice clients came in as well, because they'd seen those adverts and thought, I ought to do that. So, no advertising is bad advertising. No education of clients is bad education of clients. So that will help us. And of course, it increases the end game options for you if you're thinking about the end game in your own practice. Because one of the challenges we faced is that as practices have had to necessarily get bigger, their value has grown. And it becomes increasingly hard to find new investors, new young vets who can raise the finance to buy the old vet out. Whereas corporates have that finance. And so certainly we've seen that as a big driver for change in the UK market. We know we saw it in the US market as well. That actually practices were just too expensive to sell to the other vets. And so corporates became a new way out in terms of what happened. And we've also seen, as a result, increasing clinic value. As the number of corporates has grown, as the number of corporate inquirers has grown, the competition to buy particularly good practices has been more fierce, and that's driven up prices. In the UK, over the last 5 years, we've seen the average price paid for veterinary clinics double. In fact, I'd say it's probably now 3 times what it was 15 years ago. So the value of practices is growing, and that can be an opportunity for owners too. So it's not all bad news. What about if you work in a practice? What's in it for you? Well, as an employee, corporates, they put a lot more effort into personal development. There are far more opportunities to develop yourself as an individual in a corporate group, because they have lots of roles that small practices don't have. Lots of opportunities to grow yourself, both clinically and managerially. They often control centres of excellence as well as individual first opinion clinics, so there's chance to change. Often they're geographically diverse, so you've got an opportunity to relocate but stay with the same employer. Perhaps even to relocate internationally as well, because those opportunities are starting to emerge. So there's a lot more personal development opportunity within a corporate group. You've often got more access to expertise because the group is bigger, it advertises who it's got, it encourages you to use the experts within the group and those experts to make themselves available to you. So vets working in corporate groups say they feel much less alone because they have access to all of that knowledge and expertise around them. And of course, as I said before, you're not limited to a single clinic. They have multiple clinics, and if you feel a need to move geographically, they'll probably try and find a way to let you move with them. If you're a good employee, they won't want to lose you. And again, for some of you, that can be quite important, where you know that you're not particularly bound to the area that you currently live or work in. And generally, there's an opportunity to earn higher salaries without actually making an investment. Historically in veterinary practice, junior vets reached the ceiling. The next level came if you became an owner and had some sort of ownership share. Well, of course, in the corporates that doesn't work. You can go all the way to the top and never own a share. It's not a requirement of the job. So actually your ceiling salary will be much higher in a corporate than it's likely to be staying within a private practice, unless you get involved in ownership. Independence, well, there tends to be more clinical freedom. Corporates have to deliver things in a particular way. It's how the model works. In lots of different reasons why it works that way, but that's the model. So you'll find yourself more clinically constrained. There's often less clinical freedom in terms of your ability to influence the future direction of the business. Back to the supertanker. Often decisions are taken with a lot of inputs into them, whereas a small practice, you and the owner and 2 of the vets might decide to change the way we do something. So we can, again, the agility affects clinical decision-making and clinical freedom. There's often a greater sense of belonging in a small practice. If the owner does it right, they can create a feel that corporates find difficult to create. They can make it a really great place to work. And because you feel part of it, you can invest your energy and your emotion into it, knowing it's going to give you something back. That can sometimes feel very difficult to do when you work in a large corporate organization. And that influence in the clinic and with your colleagues is often much greater because the owner has the ability to give you that flexibility and to give them that flexibility, which again with a corporate often, because we have to operate to rules and procedures, it's the way it has to be, that can feel more cumbersome, can feel more constraining in terms of what we do. And of course, in independent, there is the opportunity for future ownership, and that may be something that excites you. It may be something that you want to do. And with the support of the existing owners, as long as they recognize the support you'll need to make that transition, it's perfectly possible still to do it. And again, that's not something that's going to happen in the corporate world. So there's pros and cons for everybody in this. The corporate isn't all bad. Independent isn't all good. It's a different mix. A bit like cats and dogs. You've got to decide you're a cat lover or a dog lover. They say you can't be both. Isn't that the way? I've heard loads of experts on the say, so you're either a cat lover or a dog lover. You can't be both. And I think it's the same with corporates. Either it'll feel right for you or it won't. I spent 20 years or more in corporate business, and I loved it. I really enjoyed what I did, and I did it really well, and people paid me tons. It was great fun. But I actually reached a point in life when I thought, I've had that now. I've done it. And I went independent, and I wouldn't go back now. 20 years later, I wouldn't go back. It was a different way of living. My lifestyle changed. I was much more free. I was certainly less rich, but much freer. And that's what we all have to think about. And as we change in life, whether you're an owner of a business or an employee in a business, your needs will change. And sometimes corporates will address that need for you, and sometimes it'll be independence. But don't be afraid of either of them. Okay, it's our future. If it's not the future in your market right now, it will be. Because all these markets move in the same way. It's just a question of when it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen. And if you want to know what the future looks like, just look at somewhere else. The most mature veterinary market's the USA. They're furthest down the track. So we can look and say, what's gone on over there? Well, there's clearly a strong corporate presence. We've got Mars all over the place. But we've also got national consolidators. We've got JV partner models. There's all sorts of stuff going on across America. Just Google it. You'll find it. But equally, there's a really vibrant independent sector. The number of speakers I've stood next to and worked with who've come from large or small independent practices who are passionate about what they do. So passionate they're sharing their knowledge across the world. If you've been to the congresses, you'll have heard these people. These aren't corporate individuals. These are independent practice owners, proud and loud and standing out there. And that's what it's going to be like. It's going to be a mixed model. It's going to be vibrant, but you've got to be distinct and differentiated. The days of being an easy veterinary practice have gone. That's the bit you can forget if you own the practice. It used to be you put up your plate and the money arrived. It doesn't work like that anymore. You've got to be really responsive to your customers. You've got to really feel what their needs are. You've got to think about how you can provide those needs in a way that a corporate practice can't. You've got to give those clients a reason to come through your door. And I know lots of the speakers will be talking about that as we move forward. Oh, that went the wrong way. So, engage with your communities. Make them want you. Make you be the practice of choice. And they serve distinct market segments. So recognize that's something independents can do really well that corporates struggle more to do. But if you look at mature markets, there's nothing to fear from corporates. They're coming and they're going to change your world. But they'll bring lots of benefits with them. But they also create lots of opportunities. So don't be afraid of it. And if you own a practice or you work in a practice and you're thinking, what is it I'm going to do going forward, then stay for my next lecture after break. And we'll talk about what I think is the future, which is wellness-centered veterinary practices. And I'll leave you with a little thought from Charles Darwin. He seemed to know a few things. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to its change. So my message to you today is be responsive to that change, but don't be afraid of it. Stand up for what you think is right. If your future is in the corporate, then join them and have a great time, because you will. If your future is independent, then do that too. If in 10 years' time your world changed and you want to do something different, don't be afraid of it. Okay? It's a really bright and exciting future. Grasp it and be part of it, and thank you for your attention.